He has a BA in political science from Stanford, and then worked for 4 years as a teacher and at a college access program out in the Bay Area. We're really excited to hear from him, and then we will open it up, as we always do, for discussion, Q&A. It may end up being discussion among the audience, etc. And we recognize that although we go until 1:30, people may have classes or other obligations that require them to leave early, and we will not look askance if you quietly leave. And then the other thing is we'll be sending around a form where if you can just sign it so we can continue making the case to higher powers that people like us and want to keep us going, so we can try to advocate for more support. And then also, if you are not on our mailing list already and you would like to be on the email list for the Civic Moral Education Initiative, just add your email address. And with that, I'll hand it over to Winston.
Thank you very much. And so I should start in those thanks by, of course, thanking Mira and Helen for this fine invitation, and also, of course, extending a thanks to Ellis for his thoughtful comments about my work. Before we get started, I've got some handouts here that I can just pass around to folks. The handouts will kind of give a sense of the overview of the arguments that I'm going to be making, and will allow you to kind of follow on. The remarks that I have for you today will be rather theoretical, conceptual remarks, and so the handout may be a little bit of a help in ensuring that it all goes smoothly. There's also a bit of space in the back there for you to write down notes. You know, this fellow has no idea what he's talking about, that type of thing, as we proceed. Okay, so let me, as you're receiving the handout now, let me just go ahead and get started with that first section. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read remarks that I've prepared in advance. Please just raise a hand if I'm going too quickly. So, surprisingly, the concept of educational justice receives relatively little consideration. Now, that statement might seem odd to those who do not directly study education, and indeed it may seem odd to quite a few of those who do. To clarify, the topic of educational justice receives quite a good deal of attention. In the U.S. and elsewhere, through either explicit or implicit invocations, public discussions of education regularly turn to language of justice. The topic is engaged when public officials issue claims or slogans regarding continued efforts in pursuit of shared educational goals. So, for example, promises that, quote, no child will be left behind, that a particular schedule of policies ensures that, quote, every student succeeds, arguably rest upon a normative foundation that invokes educational justice. Similarly, under the banner of educational justice, researchers often describe the failings of one or another educational program or institution. Perhaps even, though there's not quite enough of this to my mind, perhaps even in some cases going so far as to provide a sense of what may be required to correct or improve upon the very same. In short, the topic of educational justice is never very far from discussions of education. But these efforts provide precious little investigation of the concept of educational justice itself. Instead, they engage the topic as though the underlying concept were plainly, straightforwardly, or fully understood by those participating in the efforts that I've just described. However, while a good number of parties endorse educational justice, they may find little else upon which to agree under that banner. For some factions, this work entails engaging questions of adequacy or equality, either in access to education or across a broad range of resources or outcomes. For others, it may require appropriate forms of recognition, diversity, or meaningful reductions of prejudice. Of course, many accounts resist even these general categorizations. Despite these differences in detail, the field of study seems to count the desirability of justice in education as a universally held premise, a unifying point upon which disparate voices can agree. Again, though they agree upon the importance of the topic of educational justice, some factions hold quite conflicting views of the concept itself, such that they are in general disagreement about what it obliges and how best to pursue it in educational projects. Worse still, many who discuss educational justice miss the fact that they are speaking past one another in this way. on my view, inattention to the concept of educational justice may ultimately result in missing quite a bit more than only the fact of that simple miscommunication. So in my remarks today, I'm going to talk about educational justice, sort of investigate this concept, but I hope to move us past only seeing that there's this sort of miscommunication about folks who all agree that educational justice is important, and suggest there's actually something more that we might be missing by way of having avoided, or in virtue of having avoided the concept, and a direct engagement with that concept, or a more fulsome engagement with that concept. So strange then that attentions have not more fully tuned to the study of the underlying concept of educational justice. In what follows, I'll offer a contribution to our understanding of that concept. My remarks today will describe the popular account of educational justice, present the relationship that supports that account's status as the default position, and provide reasons for widening our sense of that relationship. In the service of giving those reasons, the essay will introduce a distinctively educational variety of justice, suggesting two ways in which it expands our conception of educational justice, and concluding by briefly noting some possible areas for further work on expanded concerns. And I hope that those end remarks there will allow us to have a bit of a conversation about ways that we might be able to move some of these ideas forward more practically than I'll do here in this rather theoretical work. So, moving on now to Section 2, the popular variety of educational justice. Scholarship on educational justice, as I've just mentioned, evidences considerable diversity in usage of that term. Some philosophers and theorists have produced quite engaging work in organizing these approaches and demarcating their foci. Rather than detail that work or rehearse the multiple approaches, in what follows I'll offer a relatively unique categorization of these approaches based upon varieties of educational justice, arguing that most work on educational justice can be firmly located within the first of the two varieties that I'll offer. Before continuing in that presentation, it may be wise to provide an overview of the ways in which a good portion of normative scholarship, explicitly philosophical or otherwise, normative scholarship on educational justice proceeds. In most contemporary contexts, educational justice is largely understood by studying educational undertakings in reference to an abiding political project. In these contexts, the usual association between the two, the educational and the political, is likely of the following types. Type 1. You can follow along here on the handout. Type 1. Some educational system is unjust because in pursuing its educational goals, it fails to honor some or another traditionally political standard of justice. Type 2. Some educational system is unjust because it fails to meet its educational goals, which ultimately are traditionally political goals. The given expectation is that the aims of this educational system are to be governed by these traditionally political standards. Now, Type 1 examples might include, among other things, issues of recognition, equality, or adequacy in the distribution of educational resources, as I mentioned earlier, or the like. So, for instance, a project founded upon this type of assessment might conclude with a statement of the following sort. So someone who's engaged in this sort of Type 1 assessment work might say something of the following. They might say, though the proposed policy will result in improved test scores, its execution necessarily runs counter to Rawlsian fair equality of opportunity for those involved, and as such is unjust, right? This is the sort of thing someone might say if they're engaged in this type of Type 1 work. Type 2 examples might include, among other things, those in which education is expected to be working towards a traditionally political outcome. For instance, a project founded upon this type of assessment might conclude with a statement of the following sort. Someone might say, the recommended curriculum ought to be abandoned because it does not properly prepare students for their political life as citizens in a pluralistic democracy. And as such, it fails to appropriately contribute to a just society, right? So it's unjust for that reason, right? So my suspicion is that these two types are somewhat familiar to you at this point, Type 1 and Type 2. This is the sorts of assessments that we might see when people are generally talking about educational justice. Now, though distinct, these types, which represent much of the breadth of normative attention to education and justice, both share a feature. Namely, the justice of the educational activities and structures is assessed relative to what are seen as traditionally political standards or aims. In this regard, the justice to be pursued in educational issues is presumably understood as political in the traditional senses. But what might be said of educational structures that do not run afoul of traditionally political standards, such that, measured by those standards, they do qualify as just, yet seem to irritate some sense of justice in the observer? Asked differently, might it be possible that Type 1 and Type 2 assessments cannot capture another variety of educational justice? Towards considering that possibility, we might entertain an example to be introduced here, but more fully explored in Section 5, subsection A, that challenges the exhaustiveness of Type 1 and Type 2 assessments. So I'm going to now offer an example here that I call the just yet unjust educational system. Right? So one might imagine, say, an ideally distributively just educational system in which, for instance, Rawlsian standards are met such that no child is unfairly advantaged relative to any other. Let us further imagine that the quality of education in this system is uniformly poor in a very specific or very particular way that does not conflict with one's status as a holder of any political rights. A student who is matriculated and progressed within that system has, in a manner identical to that of her colleagues, not developed any particular passions for the subjects of her study, nor any expertise relative to the fields in which she had previously evidenced what we might call natural talent, which I agree is sort of contentious term. Now, even if this system appears to be just by Type 1 and Type 2 standards, we can rightly expect that many observers of this system might regard these circumstances as a shame, a waste, and an injustice. These descriptions contain a normative dimension that acknowledges a real ethical and or educational failing in the student's education. So, taking seriously the sentiment expressed in declaring this situation as an injustice, suggests an account of educational justice that cannot be collapsed or simply consolidated into the usual political theories. In short, I will argue it's of another variety. Now, in order to directly consider that variety of educational justice and the way in which it's distinct from the variety described earlier, consisting of Type 1 and Type 2 assessments, we will, in the next section, more fully turn our attentions to the presumed default relationship between educational and political concerns. Before doing so, please allow me to offer two quick points that ought to be noted regarding the possibility of another variety of educational justice beyond that of the Type 1 and Type 2 assessments mentioned before, as suggested in this just yet unjust educational system example. Firstly, I acknowledge that a fully just educational system might have undesirable outcomes that are not injustices, right? It's possible that we can have a just system that's got features that aren't great, but we live with them, right? It's not necessarily an injustice, just a sort of a momentary or perhaps what we might call a misfortune. Now, though there's important work to be done on that conceptual distinction, given issues of space and time, I can only identify that the concept of educational misfortune is distinct from the concept of educational injustice, and ask that my audience grant the latter category is not empty. The intuitive force of the example above need not be softened, or the example that I've just given, need not be softened by the admission that some outcomes are educational misfortunes rather than educational injustices. I do not take the undesirable outcomes of that just yet unjust educational system example to be examples of educational misfortunes, and though I'm not going to defend it here, I'll ask you, my audience, to withhold placing those outcomes in that category at this time. So basically I'm just asking you not to declare this an example of educational misfortune. I think we've got good reason to think that it's not. I'm not going to be able to get into exactly why. I'm just asking you to sort of trust me, I suppose. So secondly, I'd like to acknowledge that there are instances in which one theory of justice does not capture the intuitions nor meet the standards of another theory of justice, and that this does not necessarily imply that one is of an entirely different variety than the other. They may simply be two very dissimilar theories within one categorical variety. This fact does not blunt the point of the example that I've just given. In some of these instances, when two theories are of the same categorical variety, both theories or views of justice or injustice might be attuned to different criteria, yet attuned to those criteria in similar ways. Right? Thus, that's the basis of their shared categorical variety, right? The way in which they engage their criteria. However, in some of these instances, both theories or views of justice or injustice might be attuned to the same characteristic. For instance, unfairness, right? Might both be attuned to the same characteristic, yet attuned to that criterion on wholly different registers, such that it makes sense to categorize the theories into distinct varieties. I assert that the example that I've just presented of the just yet unjust educational system example is of that sort. So, because no person is unfairly disprivileged according to the Rawlsian standards, the educational system is not on that register unjust. Similarly, the education that the student experiences can be described as unjust precisely because, on another register, some potential talent or expertise is unfairly disprivileged and underdeveloped relative to others, right? So they're both attuned to unfairness, but the unfairness is of a different sort, right? The way in which, the attention to that unfairness is of a different sort, such that we don't have strong reason to think of these as simply competing theories of the same sort. I'm arguing that they're actually of two entirely different varieties. It's not obvious that the simultaneous status of just and unjust in the example is simply owed to the invocation of two different theories of the same categorical variety, say two different political distributive theories of justice. I ask that my audience entertain the notion that the standards of justice might be met on one register, according to a theory of one categorical variety, while in the very same circumstances simultaneously fall short of the standards present on another register, owed to its classification within another categorical variety. My description of varieties of justice in sections 3 and section 4 will clarify this point further. Okay, so let's now turn to understanding the relationships present here in most discussions of educational justice. We're now here, if you're following along on the handout, in section 3. So towards better understanding the conceptual context of varieties of educational justice, in this section I'll label the popular variety of educational justice and offer some sense of its relationship to the variety of educational justice that I'll more fully introduce in section 4, and this will allow us to reflect upon what might be possible in expanding the scope of educational justice's reach, which I'll do in section 5. In a 2013 essay, Charles Larmore states that the standard definition of justice, quote, giving everyone their due, end quote, is unhelpful in detailing the way, in detailing why work on that concept might differ when engaged under the banner of one or another field of study. By focusing on the concept of justice across two domains, Larmore asks whether political philosophy is a branch of moral philosophy, borrowing freely from that larger field sense of what one is due, or if it might be an independent field worthy of its own status, with unique attentions and approaches to answering that core question of justice, that is, giving everyone what they are due. Larmore's concern, then, is about the relationship between these areas of study, suggesting that clarity about the nature of their association contributes to clarity regarding their respective foci. Similarly, I've argued elsewhere that scholars of education would do well to ask whether investigations into educational justice are part of some larger inquiry into justice, or if inquiries of educational justice constitute a distinctive enterprise, independent of some larger field. I've suggested that education may need to better conceive of its relationship to the larger field of study that often influences its discussions of the topic of educational justice. In short, the relationship between education and politics deserves attention, right? As I mentioned before, political standards are sort of the standards that are kind of implied as sort of the background, the foundational standards driving educational justice, and so I'm arguing that we should attend to understanding the relationship between education and politics to better refine our sense of exactly what's at stake with this default position. So as mentioned in the previous section, Type 1 and Type 2 assessments of educational justice constitute the mainstream variety of normative philosophical approaches to scholarship on educational justice. Given the traditionally political attention present in both types as standards or goals, it may be appropriate to label the variety of educational justice that they represent as the political variety of educational justice. I'll just say that again. The political variety of educational justice. Right? So what I'm suggesting here is that most of the standard accounts of our engagement with educational justice are actually accounts which originate from this category here, this political variety of educational justice. Again, most treatments of the topic of educational justice proceed as though educational activities are valuable for their instrumental role in realizing larger, traditionally political goals. In itself, this variety of educational justice is, in many ways, compelling. It aligns nicely with popular work on justice in other fields of study and presents a ready access point for many scholars who may be considering those traditionally political concerns of justice to include education within their ambit. To be clear, good and important work is conducted within this variety of educational justice. In truth, I've conducted and will continue to pursue work within this variety of educational justice alongside other projects. However, despite that fact, I submit that scholars working on education would do well to consider both the basis upon which that variety stands as the default position within discussions of educational justice, and what might be obscured as a result of that sort of default status. Firstly, the popularity of the political variety of educational justice is based in a rather limited view of the relationship between politics and education. Namely, the conceptual position that educational concerns can be enveloped within traditionally political concerns. I label this position, taken as a whole view, as the narrow view of the relationship between politics and education in context of educational justice. You can see this here on your handout. Under this narrow view of the relationship between politics and education, the pursuit of justice in education might mean ensuring that educational resources are properly distributed as social or political goods, Type 1 assessments. Or that education is arranged so as to create free and equal political citizens, Type 2 assessments. Under this exhaustive view, very little else can be attempted or accomplished. In short, traditionally political conceptions of justice direct the normative features of educational theory and focus upon a merely functional view of education. That is to say, they conceive of education only in its contributory role in the task of distributing social, political, or economic burdens and benefits upon persons. We can contrast this narrow view with what I label the wide view of the relationship between education and politics in context of educational justice. The wide view of the relationship between education and politics in these contexts encompasses the following three conceptual positions. Firstly, that educational concerns can be enveloped within traditionally political concerns, right? What we've heard before. I call this, within the wide position, within the wide view, the narrow position. Secondly, educational concerns can be engaged separately from equally regarded traditionally political concerns. I call this position, of course, the independent position. And then thirdly, the position that educational concerns can envelop traditionally political concerns. I call this the inverted position, right? So again, just to go over this once again, it's on your handout here. You see that the narrow view now becomes part of sort of the wide view, in that we've got the narrow position, the independent position, and the inverted position, sort of expanding the scope of our consideration here. The wide view builds upon the narrow view of the relationship between education and politics, allowing for an appreciation of two previously obscured possibilities, namely that education need not only rely upon political concepts and concerns, the independent position, and that politics might be understood through the unique attentions and approaches of education, that is to say, the inverted position. To be clear, the wide view does not jettison the narrow position, though it does wish to replace the exhaustive narrow view, right? So we've still got the narrow position, but what we're attempting to sort of move beyond is to move beyond holding only the narrow view, right? That is to say that default position being this one in which education is sort of subservient in some sense to political concerns. So it does not jettison the narrow position regarding the relationship between politics and education, nor does it malign all the good work that occurs within that position. I just want to be clear here, I'm not attempting to sort of attack work that's done within that position. I do wish to say, though, that its status as the default position may require us or may drive us to respond with some force. It instead seeks to expand the scope of potential work on educational justice, providing a conceptual context for the previous modes of engagement alongside new projects. In what follows, I wish to suggest that we might contrast and supplement the well-known political variety of justice with a lesser-known educational variety of justice, finding reason to accept the independent position. When this variety of justice engages educational issues, an educational variety of educational justice will be achieved. We'll get to this in section 5, subsection A. After detailing that variety of educational justice in subsequent sections, I'll also offer a sense of what an embrace of the inverted position might allow. And that will be section 5, subsection B. So now moving to section 4, another variety of justice. Elsewhere, I've implicitly described the educational variety of justice by way of offering insight into a distinctively educational variety of justice, formative justice. Building upon the work of Robert McClintock, this conceptualization of formative justice serves our present goals by detailing a variety of justice that largely relies upon an educational foundation, rather than traditionally political standards. Against the backdrop of the political variety of educational justice, and just to be clear, McClintock doesn't use exactly this language. I'm understanding these concepts through the language that I've already articulated for you here this afternoon. Against the backdrop of the political variety of educational justice, McClintock's account of formative justice serves as a candidate for a distinctively educational variety of justice. Towards introducing and articulating that concept, McClintock compares the political concept of distributive justice, often undergirding efforts within the political variety of educational justice, with the educational concept of formative justice. And this is a term that he has really coined, though he would claim, of course, that the concept is a concept that he sort of read within multiple texts over the years. But the term does come from him. McClintock sharply notes the core distinction between distributive and formative justice in that he casts the former, distributives, as perhaps the regulative principle of politics, and the latter, the formative, as performing the very same role for education. In asserting the shape of a distinctively educational variety of justice, McClintock writes, and I'm going to quote him at length here, "Issues of justice arise when a need or desire for something exceeds its supply, forcing deliberation about what each recipient is due. Issues of distributive justice stem from having to allocate a finite supply of public goods among a larger multiplicity of claimants. Issues of a distinctively educational variety, using again my language here, justice have to do not with public goods, but with potentials. In education, possibilities exceed feasible achievement, forcing choices. By exercising a distinctively educational variety of justice, a person selects among possibilities and allocates a finite supply of, say, talent, energy, motivation, discernment in pursuing these chosen goals. A distinctively educational variety of justice, again my language on top of McClintock's, thereby determines the mix of potentials that a person or groups will effectively act to achieve." In this distinction, end quote there. So in this distinction, McClintock gives a general view of justice, right? He describes for us what justice is. It's about sort of limited resources in various ways, or things. He doesn't actually say resources for, he's got a particular reason for avoiding that language in that moment. But it gives a general view on justice while also separating political and educational varieties of the concept, defining the concerns of a distinctively educational variety of justice. That said, though they are distinct, they are not necessarily wholly dependent of one another. In one of his most enduring and engaging examples, McClintock contrasts formative justice, educational, with it from its distributive cousin, political, through the example of a professional sports team. Now, those of you who follow sports closely will know if this is an accurate example or not. The rest of us can guess, I suppose. McClintock says here, the front office deals with distributive justice, at least within the tiny universe of the team, in negotiating salaries and the terms of player contracts. The issue of distributive justice here is to justify differentials in compensation, working with the players and their agents to achieve agreement through judgments about the market, their putative skill, their drawing power, or other measures of worth. If the distribution is astute, the team, its officials, players, and fans all might thrive. But will the team do so? Again, still in McClintock's language. Will the team do so? This question raises the issue of formative justice. By itself, a great collection of talent, richly remunerated, may achieve consistent success. And McClintock here writes, damn those Yankees, right? Apparently, a bit of an axe to grind. May achieve consistent success, but it does not guarantee it. Team members working with the coaching staff must use principles of formative justice to help each player reach his or her full potential and to integrate them all into a resourceful, winning team. The issue here is to get each player into optimum condition for the roles he or she has to play. To build the elan and determination of the group so that each plays with full intensity, and to develop and communicate to the team and to each constituent player an astute game plan that takes into account the unique capacities of key personnel. Finally, formative justice here consists in putting all these activities together, each in its proper measure, so that on the day of the crucial game, the whole team is shrewd together, winning in a commanding performance. And that's the end of that section there, drawing on McClintock. Now, this illustration quite powerfully conveys the view that while the distribution of resources surely has effect upon the formative activity of the team, it would be short-sighted to think that the distributive considerations are sufficient for engaging the work of the coaching staff, right? They're different activities of a different variety. Or that formative activities are solely a portion of those distributive efforts. If anything, it may make more sense to invert the relationship and think of formative justice, the educational, as often enveloping distributive concerns, the political. Right? The formation of a winning team may require fair compensation, as the alternative may result in a greater likelihood that team members disengage from the pursuits of collective goals, right? So the example here drawn is to think that we need to get the distribution right so that people can engage in the formation, right, in the formative. It is this idea that the formation or education of groups that motivates my attentions in the following section. But before moving on, 3 issues ought to be noted regarding formative justice as a distinctively educational variety of justice. Firstly, as I mentioned earlier, though he's brought the term and concept to contemporary scholarship, McClintock is clear to note that the concept of formative justice has rather ancient roots. In his study of Plato's Republic, McClintock notes that the text, like many others worthy of our careful and considered review, predates the sharp disciplinary distinctions assumed in a contemporary context. And as such, he avoids the disciplinary determinism that would bind the ideas of the text to specific spheres of knowledge. Though its study has largely been pursued through the disciplines that the Academy has come to associate with the political, right, political philosophy, political theory, etc., McClintock reads this foundational text, and many potential others, to contain vital educational notions that can be recovered for our contemporary usage. Indeed, McClintock's sports team example might be read to invoke one of the major thrusts of Plato's text, right? The notion that justice requires the appropriate balance between an application of constituent portions of its subject. For the sports team, this calls attention to the skills of the individual players and the way in which their potentials might unite to create a just outcome. Plato's description of the classes of the Callipolis is no different, though we ought to recall that the description of that beautiful city serves as an analogy for the description of the person. Justice in the person similarly requires the careful balance and appropriate development of constituent skill, dispositions, and desires, quote, each working with the others, keeping to its proper business, integrated in pursuit of the good, end quote. So that's the first point that I want to make there about McClintock's work on formative justice. Secondly, on the heels of noting the ways in which that ancient text pursues political and educational ideas in one project, one should note that the varieties of justice that I'm demarcating today might best be understood as perhaps accents within attentions to justice, right? So rather than wholly disconnected from one another, we might begin to think of these as we might conceptually think of them as distinct, while also recognizing that there is some overlap and some mixing between them in a very real sense. As suggested previously and pursued within the next section, even that which has traditionally been viewed as political may contain decidedly educational components. That the tradition has not labeled and engaged these dimensions need not suggest that they are incompatible with the aims of the standard projects, nor that they fall outside of hard limits to their boundaries. Given McClintock's account of formative justice, a distinctively educational variety of justice can be meaningfully applied to situations of education or politics as traditionally classified. And then my third point on McClintock here is that while I take McClintock's work on formative justice to provide grounding for a distinctively educational variety of justice, I do not take McClintock to have provided a particular theory within that variety. I've argued elsewhere that this category, what I'm here calling the educational variety of justice, may be as large as the category of the political variety of justice, such that it is capacious and may contain a multitude of theories, just as one might envision the diverse range of theories within the political variety of justice. For example, competing theories of distributive justice, just to sort of stay with that example that we've been using. Right? So too might one begin to envision the scope of theories within the educational variety of justice. Right? Again, this is not a theory that I'm identifying here. I'm identifying, if you will, a category in which theories can be placed. The remarks within this the remarks that I'm giving here to you this afternoon might be understood as invoking portions of particular theories of the educational variety of justice. These glimpses, or these portions, are offered as examples in order to make broader points about the types of questions that might be pursued when we refocus our attentions. In my remarks today, I wish to remain rather inclusive about the distinctively educational theories of justice in order to example the larger issue of how these theories might be leveraged within the standard and expanded domains. So let's now move on to think about new possibilities. As suggested in the beginning of my remarks today, inattention to the concept of educational justice may result in overlooking far more than only the fact of the disagreement, than overlooking far more than only the fact that disagreement exists regarding what it requires. We risk both, firstly, overlooking the varieties of justice that we can usefully invoke, and secondly, overlooking the range of issues to which these varieties can speak, right? Because we've got I argue, a relatively shallow notion of educational justice if we're not attending to the concept itself. Towards making these issues clear, we might consider the educational variety of justice in application to both traditionally educational and political domains. So, firstly, educational applications. The most obvious avenues for work built upon the educational variety of justice are likely those projects which address traditionally educational issues. Given the distinctions of the previous section, we can now turn to the educational variety of educational justice. Again, the educational variety of educational justice, which we can contrast with my earlier statement about the political variety of educational justice. So, the educational variety of educational justice. Suspecting that many characteristics of inquiries under this variety of educational justice are fairly easily imagined, I will not devote much time this afternoon to detailing their features. The distinctively educational variety of justice is well suited to the task of capturing the unique and essential features of education that might otherwise be missed. In attending to issues of potential and formation, this variety of educational justice cannot be reduced to traditionally political concerns. As such, we have reason for accepting the independent position, the second of the novel wide-view positions that I mentioned initially in Section 3, noting that these educational concerns can be engaged separately from traditionally political concerns, with neither set eclipsing the other. While the educational variety of educational justice may be the clearest implication of a distinctively educational variety of justice, I do not wish to suggest that this obvious application is not necessarily uncomplicated. As mentioned earlier, this variety of educational justice may contain numerous theories and approaches that deserve careful articulation and consideration. One ought not presume that these will be plainly, straightforwardly, or fully understood without serious conceptual work. That work, unfortunately, is beyond the scope of my remarks this afternoon. However, given the applications of the previous section, Section 4, we might begin to glimpse this complexity by recognizing that the core impulses of the educational variety of educational justice solicits its subjects to question the mix of potentials to be achieved. Though multiple parties may agree to that imperative, again, it would seem that this agreement is merely a precursor to a more extensive set of queries. So, two examples, I think, underscore this point. Firstly, I'd like to return to the earlier example of the just yet unjust educational system, right? So, that example suggests that our dissatisfaction with the described scenario rests in the awareness that one might not have realized an appropriate mix or the appropriate mix of potentials as a distinctively educational concern. But that, I think, deserves to be revisited. Of course, the earlier presentation of this example relied upon the notion that natural talents and interests may, at least partially, serve as a good guide to what potentials one ought to which potentials one ought to develop. Now, but this is not uncontroversial. In fact, though not labeled as standards for a distinctively educational theory of justice, a broad range of such standards exists within the educational literature, right? So what I'm suggesting here is that these standards are already there in the literature, not labeled as such, not organized in this fashion, but we can find them there, right? The standards that might drive us to sort of recognize, that might direct us as we recognize distinctively educational forms of educational justice here. Again, there's good work to be done in re-examining these AIM standards, to say nothing of the pedagogical questions of how they're pursued within the context of a distinctively educational variety of justice. Now, the second example or point that I'd like to make here to underscore the earlier point is that the educational variety of educational justice might also be useful in making sense of traditionally educational experiences that occur outside of the structured institutions of schools. Consider, for example's sake, issues of identity formation. Many pages have been written about the social educational process of becoming, for example, a woman within a gendered society, or learning how to inhabit a racial minority identity, or any number of other socially enforced roles. These might be explored with sharp attention to their educational dimensions, even as they impact political issues. Right? So just because they're impacting political issues doesn't mean that we wouldn't do well to focus on these educational dimensions in the way that I'm suggesting. Indeed, Miranda Fricker, in some of her more popular work, works towards this set of concerns in noting that in some cases of what she refers to as hermeneutical injustice, which is characterized as a deficit of shared resources for social interpretation, such that a significant area of one's social experience can be obscured, even from one's own self. Right? So Fricker invokes hermeneutical injustice So I'll just read the sentence again. Indeed, Miranda Fricker works towards this set of concerns in noting that in some cases of what she calls hermeneutical injustice, one, quote, may be prevented from becoming who they are, end quote. Right? So in thinking of a hermeneutical injustice in this sense, Fricker is thinking about the ways in which we have these sorts of epistemic limitations to the ways in which we come to know ourselves, such that we might be limited in actually becoming who we are, using her language there. Fricker seems to be suggesting something of the closely related injustices impacting self-knowledge and self-development in an epistemological and pedagogical sense. Having one's potential to appropriately understand and value aspects of one's identity alongside the very process of coming to recognize one's potentials despite that socially constructed identity might be, among other things, an educational shortcoming. Or, more pointedly, an educational injustice with far-ranging effects. And again, I think there's some of this work in existence, right? But this is a reclassification, a recategorization of what it is we're up to, such that we can make links and unite particular projects, right? I'm thinking now of Carter G. Woodson's classic text, right? The Miseducation of the Negro, right? In some sense, if we were to focus on particularly those issues that are educational issues within that text, we see new possibilities opening up. In this, we might begin to imagine social and political implications. Though not dependent upon other domains, these inquiries into educational applications of the educational variety of justice may reverberate across other domains. Though essentially or primarily educational in their intentions, these examples evidence the ways in which a focus on the educational may begin to impact that which has traditionally been considered political. But I'll now turn my attentions to that option more fully. So I'd like to talk about political applications here. That the educational variety of justice might impact traditionally political concerns suggests that a third variety of educational justice has crept into our view. The educational variety of political justice. Now, what I mean to suggest here is that when we use the term educational justice, we might actually use it in this way, right? To talk about educational justice as something other than those things that we normally talk about it as being related to, we might be able to engage the educational variety of political justice. This variety of justice focuses upon that which has traditionally been understood to be political, yet considers those issues with an eye to educational standards and their obligations. Educational standards and their obligations. While this variety of educational justice may offer a new view on political questions, it also encompasses some familiar conceptual terrain. Let us return to the Type 2 popular work on educational justice that I mentioned in Section 2. Much of that work might be closely related to potential work done on the educational variety of political justice. For example, inquiries into whether and how persons are formed into the right type of persons. For example, a citizen capable of robust forms of civic participation, might be evaluated via political standards, as would be the case in most Type 2 assessments, or via educational standards, with attention to their potentials and how best to realize them, broadly construed. Not only is it the case that work of this sort requires only a small shift from Type 2 assessments, some examples of this approach already exist within the educational scholarship. Turning towards new possibilities, however, the educational variety of political justice offers a relatively novel question at its core. Namely, in political contexts, what is owed to persons and polities as a matter of education rather than political justice? What is owed to persons and polities as a matter of educational rather than political justice? Answers to this question are well beyond the scope of my remarks this afternoon, but a few thoughts on the form of potential replies might be instructive. Political life might have educational obligations of various sorts. These educational obligations might manage political processes or their outcomes, or both. For example, following McClintock's lead in reading educational ideas in political texts, one might read John Stuart Mill's directives regarding liberty of thought and discussion to suggest an educational standard or an educational dimension to free speech standards that drives the processes and achievable potentials of a population. One might also appraise the outcomes of a system of government, taking issue with the educational shortcomings that it perpetuates. Or one might look at a theory of justice, right? And look at the ways in which it is perhaps focused only on the political and ignores or is silent about the educational, and call that political theory into question, right? As we note that it might miss certain features of life that we'd like to see some sensitivity directed. In the broad sense, John Dewey does a fair bit of this linking when he links democracy as a system of government and a way of life with an enduring political project. Dewey notes that various educational systems and standards might align more or less well with a given set of political norms. Following Dewey, one might appraise types of political systems according to educational standards, right? So it might be the case, as Dewey seems to believe, right, that democracy is a better way of life because it's sort of more educational, right? It sort of allows us to really take seriously the educational dimensions of the life that we live with one another, and other forms of life or other forms of government kind of miss out on those educational issues or concerns, right? Is Dewey's view. But in a more focused sense, a particular political system might be evaluated according to the educational injustices present, perhaps especially if they are recurrent within it. Here, one might return to the political dimensions of gender or race, for instance, in the contemporary U.S. context, investigating these issues through educational standards. Or perhaps one might take issue with the educational injustices present within a democratic political system that has embraced an increasingly blurred distinction between facts and falsehoods, or otherwise spurn practices that contribute to joint processes of public problem solving as an act of shared study. In short, possibilities abound. Right? There are many different ways that we might begin to think of sort of the educational dimensions of political life. The educational implications of these and other political circumstances are plentiful. As such, we have reason for accepting the inverted position, the third of the novel wide view positions that I offered in section 3, noting that these educational concerns can engage traditionally political concerns, evaluating them according to educational standards. To be sure, this variety of educational justice attunes one to the uniquely educational challenges of forming and continually reforming a political body, especially one comprised of persons who have emerged from dissimilar histories, hold seemingly incommensurate views, and endeavor to construct seemingly divergent outcomes. Recalling the definition of the distinctively educational variety of justice offered in section 4, politics, especially in a democratic context, can be understood as an essentially educational project. It is the process by which a group forms itself while attempting to do justice to its many potentials. Right? So what I'm offering here is a way of recasting politics as an educational activity, such that we might more readily invoke educational norms and standards in attempts to understand that set of phenomena. Okay, so just to conclude, by pressing our attentions beyond only the topic of educational justice, this set of remarks this morning has clarified ways in which that concept might be utilized. Contrasting popular accounts of educational justice, political varieties of educational justice, with varieties that depend upon a distinctively educational variety of justice, this essay has offered 2 additional varieties of educational justice. Both the educational variety of educational justice and the educational variety of political justice might be invoked when engaging, as scholars or concerned laypersons, the topic of educational justice. On the basis of that demonstration, my remarks this afternoon have also shown that one has reason to adopt the wide view of the relationship between politics and education. Replacing the narrow view with the wide view allows for greater dexterity in addressing educational and political issues well beyond the scope of the popular variety of educational justice. By deprioritizing the narrow view of the relationship between politics and education, now a narrow position, in contexts of educational justice, and adopting a wide view of the range of this relationship, I have suggested that we can ask new educational questions of phenomena and circumstances that traditionally have been solely political. In closing, I would briefly observe that this exercise has both clarified and hopefully complicated the concept of educational justice, such that it might be more deftly employed. Given the nuance offered by my remarks this afternoon, we might better describe and address issues of educational justice within educational and political contexts. Our focus on the presumed simple concept of educational justice has opened a range of generative questions and attentions for our further work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Thompson, for the really interesting paper and for letting me give a brief comment on it. Okay, I think that you argue really convincingly that theories of justice ought to pay greater attention to distinctively educational issues. As your just yet unjust educational system hypothetical captures, dominant notions like fair equality of opportunity only capture some of our intuitions about what constitutes a just education. After reading our paper, I think that's right. Instead of treating schools as black boxes out of which pop more or less undifferentiated individuals vying for positions of social advantage, theorists of justice need to think more deeply about the decisions made over the course of an individual's education. I have two questions I'd like to pose, which I hope will hopefully work to clarify some pieces of your argument. My first question centers on the role of Robbie McClintock's concept of formative justice in your argument. You argue that McClintock's formative justice provides a framework for conceiving of a distinctively educational variety of justice, whereas the political variety of educational justice views education as instrumental to some set of political aims. An educational variety of educational justice, based on this notion of formative justice, centers education and the choices made to develop or not develop particular individual potentials. Quoting McClintock, you write that this, quote, distinctively educational variety of justice determines the mix of potentials that a person or group will effectively act to achieve. Later, you offer a hypothetical developed by McClintock about a well-formed soccer team to clarify the distinction between formative and distributive conceptions of justice. We just heard your description of the hypothetical, so I won't run through it again now. What I'm curious about specifically is how we should understand what constitutes a well-formed soccer team within the hypothetical, and by extension, what constitutes a well-formed individual or social group. So on one possible reading of McClintock's hypothetical, a well-formed soccer team would be one where the distinctive capacities of each player are fully developed, every player knows her role, and the team embodies the, quote, elan and determination of the group, so that each plays with full intensity. In the educational context, however, how would one establish what an individual's proper role is, or which potential ought to be developed? As you know, McClintock explicitly connects his work to Plato, and specifically the Platonist notion that, quote, justice requires the appropriate balance between an application of constituent portions of its subject. Given the central role the concept of formative justice plays in your argument, to what extent must one accept these Platonist underpinnings to embrace the distinctively educational variety of justice you propose? So that's my first question. My second question is related, but focuses specifically on the relationship between educational and political goals. You argue convincingly that within the educational context, the distributive account of justice, such as Rawls's fair equality of opportunity, is silent with respect to the work that actually goes on in schools and other educational settings. Whereas Rawls implicitly treats education as instrumental to political ends, you argue that we can and should engage with educational questions independent of political goals. Miranda Fricker's concept of hermeneutic and justice offers one motivating example for thinking about educational ends independently. But might our intuitions about hermeneutical injustice, however, be captured by some relational account of justice and not formative justice? Might we believe, for instance, that hermeneutical injustice is injustice because it prevents some individuals from seeing themselves as social equals to others in their social group for morally suspect reasons, and not because one is, quote, prevented from becoming who they are? As you suggest, such a theory might fit squarely into what you call the educational variety of political justice, as opposed to the educational variety of educational justice. Such an account of justice would exemplify what you call the inverted position because it centers the relationship between educational aims and politics. However, once you've accepted that a relational account of justice of the sort I very briefly sketched out captures our intuitions about hermeneutic injustice, can we still understand Fricker's work that also exemplifies the independent position of educational justice? That is, if our primary concern with if our primary concern with hermeneutical injustice has to do with whether or not it allows for different individuals to see themselves as social equals, do we still understand it as somehow independent of political goals? In a way, this brings me back to my first question, which put in slightly different terms, is does the independent position demand we accept some sort of notion of individual perfectibility? So those are my two quick questions. Thank you again very much for the paper. I really enjoyed reading it. Yeah, thank you.
So I'll just, I suspect, respond first to Ellis's two very good questions, and then I guess we'll open those up more broadly. So Ellis, I think that you're right about a certain type of perfectionism that's in the paper. It's in the thinking there. I'm inclined to be comfortable with it, and here's why. So I'm inclined to say that it's a weak form, it's a weak or soft kind of perfectionism. It's not particularly strong. It's certainly not developed here in a particular direction. But I do think that there is going to be a type of, for the type of work that I'm envisioning, I do think that there is going to have to be some perfectionist, if you will, thread or element running throughout that gives a sense of what it is we're after, that's described as being something more than just what the individual person likes or wants in a particular moment. The reason that I'm not too strongly down on that is that that seems to me to be very much like what a lot of education looks like. And I don't mean to suggest overly coercive education, although I think all education is necessarily coercive. But what I mean to suggest is that there is a sense in educational projects of pursuing something that is objectively desirable, even if in the moment it is painful or the subject claims that it's not what they desire, right? I mean, I recently started exercising, right? And I dislike it quite a bit. But even in those moments of struggle and hardship, there's something sort of on the horizon that I think is good. Even if the me in the particular moment, 7 in the morning, doesn't want to go to the gym, there's this kind of ideal on the horizon. So I do think that there is, so that kind of speaks to the issues of perfectionism in both questions. But in the first question, so I just would like to say that I don't think that, again, so I do think that in order to make that, to answer that question, right, to what sort of allows us to identify the appropriate mix of potentials, I do think we need a theory to inhabit this category that I'm describing here via McClintock. Again, I don't think McClintock gives us that theory, so I think it's tricky in a sense, right? I mean, he gives us, in that example of the sports team, he says they're going to win, right? We kind of, that brushes past us because we think, of course, that's what sports teams do, they win. But human beings, persons rather, are far more complicated, right? What is it that persons are after? Well, winning seems to be an unhelpful concept to invoke here. There's something that we are after, though, and I think that most accounts of education, with some notable exceptions, I'm thinking of anarchist approaches to education or folks who work on education and are very particular about not having aims, do have some aims in mind about sort of human nature and about what it means to be a well-developed person. And so in that regard, I'm not particularly frustrated by the perfectionism there, because I think I think that's appropriate. Now, what the direction in which we direct that, I think, is the interesting theoretical work. And McClintock, of course, does give some sense of the full development, which I think is a mistaken term and should be avoided. Though I do think there are some folks who are doing some really interesting work in thinking about concepts closely related to sort of full development. I'm thinking of some of the work done by Director Rauter over at the Vrije Universiteit van Amsterdam. She's done some really interesting work on sort of thinking about optimization in education, and education for becoming sort of an optimizer. Although in her work she's thinking primarily about parents and children, and what it means to sort of optimize your children, which I'm recent parents are now very interested in, but my own view is a little bit softer. Okay, on your second question, I think actually, so I think this is a very beautiful question because I think you get at Fricker better than I do in my remarks. And what I mean by that is that I think that you're absolutely right. When Fricker is talking about epistemic injustice, particularly hermeneutical injustice, she is talking about power, social power, a context in which there is kind of a give and take, a relationship between persons. And I think that you're right to identify that. However, that said, though I think that Fricker would sort of move away in some ways from the independent position as I've laid it out here, I actually think she'd be mistaken to do so for the following reason. If we were to imagine a very delicate, I suspect, social arrangement in which all persons in a particular community all suffer from a particular type of hermeneutic injustice, right? It might be all people of color suffer from sort of people of color hermeneutic injustice, all women from a sort of gender-based hermeneutical injustice, right? On down the list. It might be the case that we're all suffering from some hermeneutical injustice, such that since we're all afflicted by sort of equal measure of injustice, that we are actually social equals. But we might still not have a sense of ourselves, right, of a certain sort, that I think would be frustrating to the educator. So even if, and I'm now sort of throwing myself to the audience here to see if others are going to agree or disagree, but I do think that even if, right, the persons in this envisioned community could regard one another as equals, there's still some sense, I think, that we'd want them to get to know themselves better, right? That there's something missing there, something lost, right? Even if it's balanced by the losses that others experience, I think, as educators, there's still a sense of some more to be pushed there, or at least that's my intuition. Others may differ.
I suggest you wrap up within about a minute, just so we have at least a few minutes.
Okay. And that's the end of it.
Okay. Questions or comments?
Oh dear.
Larry?
So I'm still a little unclear how justice as a particular normative idea is being situated within a broader field of other evaluative and normative concepts that could apply to education. And so I wondered whether I was understanding, McClintock's use of justice as something that applied in an area of scarcity, a kind of situation of scarcity, so that justice is about principles that you need when you can't develop everybody's potentials to their fullest.
Right.
So there's a certain kind of anti-perfectionism involved in that. That is, people, you can't use the development of everyone's potentials as a goal because that's just not achievable and it's not helpful. And so is justice a way of handling the choices that, as it were, the system has to make, or a school or a teacher has to make to develop some potentials rather than others because we can't do all of them?
Yes, I think that's correct, and I think that's a helpful question to clarify in a number of ways. So the first thing that I would say is that not only is it true for McClintock that set of questions ought to be engaged when thinking about things from the from the point of view of the school or the society, but also from the point of view of the individual, rather the person, right? So as a person, I recognize that I can was younger, I had some talents in chess and some talents in playing the piano and some talents in tap dancing, right? Maybe I can do all of these things, but perhaps I can't, so I've got to make some choices about how to develop my potentials, right? And so those questions for McClintock are going to be questions of formative justice, right? Given the potentials that I've got, how am I going to develop them? What sort of standards am I going to use to make some of these hard decisions and choices about how to proceed? Now, I think that what McClintock doesn't do, and what I've not fully done, is provide a particular theory, as Ellis pointed us to here. Haven't provided a particular theory that guides us in that work. I've got some ideas about what a good theory would look like, but I want to sort of hold off on providing a particular theory to sort of just suggest that we engage those questions as questions that I think, to some degree, haven't been placed fully on the table yet.
So if I'm deciding which of my potentials to develop, he regards that as a justice issue? My individual choice to develop something that will then realize some but not all of my potential?
Yes. As an issue of formative justice. So it might be helpful then, I suspect, to think of sort of. So it is in some sense, that there are some perhaps self-regarding obligations here, right? I have this skill. This is a thing that I suspect, Larry, you probably heard when you were younger, or maybe you didn't. I heard this when I was younger. You're wasting your talents, right? I'll say this about myself. You're wasting your. I was going to say it in a positive way for you, but I said it negative. You're wasting your talents, right? You owe it to yourself, right? To really get, you've got such good skill. Look at this person and that person, how hard they try to be half as good as you, right? You owe it to yourself to really give yourself over, right? So in this case, my mother has a particular account, right, of what I ought to be pursuing, different from my account, but an account nonetheless, right? Yes.
So, yeah, thanks very much for a really interesting talk. Just to help me understand further, so when you going back to McClintock's quote here that you used, so a person selects among possibilities. So maybe this is a really basic question, but
Sure.
You're thinking about that as thinking about the educational application, right? So is that a student? Is that a teacher? If it's are there different choices for one or the other? That's sort of related to Larry's question, but I guess help me understand.
No, that's terrific. So
those choices, and the group also. I imagine that could be a school, maybe. Or
it could, yeah. So it could be. Yeah. So it could be a school, but again, on my reading, it could also be a town, right? It could be a country, right? It could be the global community in some sense, right? So there. I do think that you're right to know that there are going to be various levels of engagement for this question, right? So we might think of the ways in which the individual chooses to make choices about her or himself, right? And then we think of the ways in which those around that person, perhaps in positions of some authority or positions of some responsibility for that person's development.
Teacher, parents.
Exactly. Might have certain obligations. And there's work that sort of suggests exactly how we make choices and how difficult it is to make choices regarding the development of another person. But I do think that there is a dimension, if we read McClintock's work here in the way that I'm reading it, I do think that there is a dimension to that process that is, again, this kind of engagement with potentials, having to make choices about what we develop, what we allocate, what we give our attentions to, our energies to, and so on and so forth, right? To get it right, to do it well, to get the appropriate mix of potentials, right? Now again, many of us are going to have disagreements about what the appropriate mix of potentials are. But what I'm attempting to do here in this paper is to suggest that, one, when we talk about educational justice, this is one of the things that we can be talking about. And two, if we are talking about these sorts of things, let's now get clear about the theories that we're invoking, such that we're no longer speaking past one another. And then finally, if we are invoking a particular theory, it might be the case that that theory can be directed towards these things that we traditionally think about as being educational, but it can also be directed towards these things that we don't traditionally think of as educational, the political. Oftentimes, and I don't, I don't begrudge, my colleagues from, other disciplines who come into education for a bit of, fun in study, right? The folks from various other disciplines will sometimes come into education and sort of engage in a project or two and then leave again, and that's right. But what I'm suggesting is that folks who work in education might be able to contribute something useful, something substantive to these other domains, right? Rather than inviting those folks into our halls, we might also travel into their domain and provide something of some real value.
Yeah,
Yes.
that actually directly leads into what I was going to say, which I thought was a bit out of the arena, but now you brought it back in again, which is the fact that there's a traditional distinction between education and political science. She was saying, I'm talking about political science rather than political philosophy. It's almost macro-micro, but it's also a question of what kind of process they're involved in. Education is about processes between people in institutional contexts. And one of the interesting things about the history of education in the context of justice is how dramatically, in many ways, the scene shifts and what's important changes. And furthermore, when it changes, quite dramatic things happen for education, like what happened with diversity education in the last 40 years, environmental education. Now, in a way, I suppose my question really is, the way you're talking about political issues is sort of out there, a bit sort of static. I'm sure you didn't mean it like that,
No,
but
sure,
the sense
yes.
in which, as your last comment made, I do think that political thinking, whether it's political science or political philosophy, should learn and has learned a huge amount from the kind of, almost on the ground experiences of justice and the changing parameters of justice in the educational context. And I wondered what you thought about that. You've been quite nice to political scientists implicitly.
Sure.
Maybe we should be more, say to them more, look, this is what's really happening.
Sure,
These are real examples.
Sure.
Take it seriously and alter your perspectives.
Sure. No, I think that's fair. I think that's a quite good point. So to my thinking, so I did mention, though this was a very small section of my comments, right?
Right.
I am thinking about this as sort of accents, right? Rather than sort of education here, politics here, and let's now, right? I do think that these are sort of accents because the space between the two is, as you rightly note, more complicated than I've made it seem here for the purposes of just drawing some sort of conceptual limits, if you will. But yes, so I take your point quite fully. Perhaps I ought to be sort of shaking the finger a little bit more firmly at folks. It is my, this is part of an abiding, sort of an ongoing project, but I do think, that in many places, I'll only talk about North America and Western Europe because those are the contexts that I know most fully, but I do think that it's often the case that scholars working in education are presumed to be doing work that only matters, right, if you know a child, right, or if you live next to a school, et cetera, et cetera. And I agree that the work that we do, and I've tried to argue here and to articulate, the work that we do can have a much larger focus.
Agreed.
I'd just like to press you a little on the implications for Dewey, so how you think about Dewey.
Yeah.
Because in some way, Dewey, I don't know Dewey that well, but he doesn't come down hard on the concept justice explicitly, right?
No.
So he's got an idea of democracy, and in some ways he's collapsing political and educational. In a way it's a version of the inverted, but in some ways it's also just like all mixed up together, sort of.
Yeah, it's more of an amalgam, right? Than it is an inversion, right? So I think.
So it's not any of the three.
I wouldn't say so. But I do think that there are certain ways in which you can take some insights from Dewey towards the inverted position that I've outlined here. But I think that you're quite right. And that, Dewey rather famously in most of his books, right, to have that conjunction and, right, suggesting that that he's not making a choice between either. He's sort of saying, democracy and education, right? We're bringing them together and showing the ways in which they're both, in some sense, the same thing applied in different directions. And that's an oversimplification of Dewey. But I do think that in that work, we do begin to see ways in which educational concepts, one example of a way in which a set of educational concepts can be directed towards things that are traditionally seen as political.
But I guess, so I guess another piece of my question was, how to think about justice in relationship to other, normative and evaluative concepts. So Dewey doesn't use justice very much. Is there some way of locating justice in the Deweyan field?
I see.
And then sort of then how does it relate to other values that Dewey is much more explicitly concerned with, some of which are clearly educational in character?
Yeah.
I'm going to let you think about that,
Sure.
answer that to Larry afterwards, because it's
It is time, yes.
1:30. So thank you very much.